Sure is good to see everyone here today. It's a beautiful day to serve and worship our God. And the book of Job, boy, I'll tell you what a book. Have you ever thought where we would be without the book of Job? Do you even know about the book of Job? This book is one of those that as you read it, you wonder, how could God do that? How could God let that happen? And yet it's one of the most important jobs, I think, that have been done in the history of man. That is being Job. I was looking in the paper the other day for jobs. Not that I'm looking for a job, but I'm looking for what people are looking for when they hire someone. What is it that you want when you put an ad in the paper and you ask somebody to come to work for you? Can you imagine the amount of money that is spent on screening out bad, poor employees? The amount of money that is spent trying to get just the right people to work in your particular place, whatever it is. How much money does the federal government spend vetting people and making sure they're not going to do something opposite of the job that they're called upon to do? The book of Job is a standard. This book is one that I read for years and years and years without understanding. It's a book that if you really stop and ponder, shows how much God counts on some of His people to do unbelievable things. Extraordinary. Like we have Moses, who's called upon to go save the people out of Egypt. He'd already been to Egypt. He understood what Egypt was like. It took a very special man to go do that job. And we stop and think about it, Moses spent 80 years preparing to do 40 years' work. I don't know how long Job prepared. But I do know one thing. I do know that this did not happen just right off the bat. And I forgot my glasses.
Here's one.
I'll get these because they don't have any scratches on them. This book of Job, I want to start out by saying that the eyes of the Lord are in every place, watching the evil and the good. That is, that God has those watching all of us from the time we're born, all the way through our lives. Everything that we do, everything that we say, every thought that we have is a part of what God knows us to be. Let me read this beginning in chapter 1 of Job. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless, upright, fearing God and turning away from evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. His possessions were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels. I'm not going to read all of that, but he was a rich man. It says he was the greatest of the men of the East. His sons, all 7 of them and 3 daughters, they used to hold a feast. And Job was such a good man, he was concerned about his children, so every time his children would get together and have a feast, Job would offer sacrifices for them to make sure that one of them had not cursed God. And that brings up a situation. The situation is that God needs good people. when God gets good people, there are times when those good people are called upon to do things that are way above and beyond what normally would be asked of anyone. So there comes a day when Satan comes before the Lord like all of the angels. And God knows what's in his mind. He says, "Have you considered my servant Job, a blameless and upright man, good in everything that he does?" This is a good man. And Satan, who is constantly on the lookout for those that he can pull astray, those that he can make to be disloyal to God, says, well, why wouldn't he? Why wouldn't he be loyal to you? Because you give him everything. And he says you put him in this protected place. Actually, he says you put a hedge about him. That is the word for paradise, a hedge around, a protected place. You've put him in this protected place and you care for everything he does. I'll tell you what, you take some of that away from him, he'll curse you to your face. Now you might think that this is just a story of something that happened. But this is not just a story. This is God establishing a standard of behavior. A standard of behavior that he considers to be faithful and loyal. A standard of behavior that can be an example to people from this moment until the end of time. Where do you find somebody that can do that for you? You know, when we want to do something like protect ourselves from terrorists, we don't go down to the high school and get 4 or 5 boys and put a uniform on them and have them go out and do that job. Because that's a lot to ask. That's a lot to ask of people. To put themselves in harm's way. To take their lives and put it on the line for people that don't even know them, don't even care about them. But we ask people to do that. But we don't ask just anyone to do that. We ask people who are prepared to do that. People who have trained to do that. People who have suffered and sacrificed and made it known that they are capable of going through whatever misery might be available at the time. Now, let's go back to Job, because I don't know about Job. It doesn't say anything about him except that God, whose eyes are everywhere at all times, watching this man at this point in Job's life. He's an older man, I can tell you that. He's got 7 sons and they have families. He says this man has demonstrated every day of his life that he is blameless. That means he's not guilty of anything. This man is a good man. Anybody that sees this man knows he's a good man. He's demonstrated it day after day after day after day. He's upright. He's not a crook. You don't have to have a signed contract with this man. A handshake will do the job. Because if he says it, he does it. He fears God. Wow, that's a step in the right direction. He fears God. Now, this has been going on for a long time. And this man is the one that God calls upon on this occasion to be his gold standard of humanity. To live this example for all people, for all time. Because I'll tell you what, when things start happening to you, when things start happening to you that you say, that's not my fault, I don't deserve that, you need to read the book of Job. Because Job has an understanding that God's view of things is so much more vast than our tiny little perspective. So, I want us to read some about what happens here. The devil says that about Job. If you hurt him, if you turn against him, he will curse you to your face. Well, it didn't happen that way. So the next time Satan comes before the Lord and the Lord says, "Have you considered my servant Job again?" One of the things that is impressive about this to me is that there's a passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13 that says, "No temptation has overtaken you but such as is common to man." Every one of us that face something, we're not the first. We're not going to be the last. It comes and it goes and it touches everybody in life. But one of the things that is said in that passage is, "No temptation has overtaken you but such as is common to man. And God is faithful." We talk about our faith a lot. We talk about how we have faith in God, we trust God, or we don't trust God. But this is talking about God is trustworthy. We can count on God that this is a true statement. He says, God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. Man, have I thought about that a lot. I must be a strong dude. I've thought about how many times I've been in this position thinking, Lord, what are you doing to me? Why is it that we're going through this? Why are you putting this on me? And then I read about Job. Out of all the people in the world, there was one man right here who could set this gold standard of acceptance of God's will better than anybody else. Now what happens here is that Satan says, okay, you hurt him and he'll turn against you. Well, that didn't happen. So then he says, well, you take everything he has and you hurt his body and he'll turn against you. That didn't happen. Job's wife says, why don't you curse God and die? And that didn't happen. But from that point on, all the way through the rest of the book of Job, Job and his three friends start analyzing the situation, saying, why? Why? Why is this happening to me? Why is this happening to you, Job? For 35 chapters, we have that going on in the book of Job. And then in chapter 38, a curious thing happens. Someone has been listening all of this time without saying anything. In chapter 38, God speaks. And it's amazing what God says. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? He's talking about 35 chapters of this is why it happened. This is what happened to you, Job, and this is what you did. You know, when you read what Dan just read, I want to go over there and read just a little bit of this here, and I want to talk about it as we do. Eliphaz, the Temanite. He says, if one ventures a word with you, will you become impatient? Now, understand, they've been just sitting with Job in a circle for 7 days without saying anything. They've just been there with him. I'm your friend. I'm sitting here with you. I'm going through this with you. They tore their clothes. They threw dust and ashes on their heads. And they sat while Job scraped himself with a potsherd, scraping scabs off of his body. Then Eliphaz says this. If one ventures a word with you, are you going to get mad if I say something here, Job? But who can refrain? I've got to talk. I've got to tell you what I think. Behold, you have admonished many. That means counsel by warning. Job has been the kind of man that he's been the backbone of his society. He's been the judge. He's been the corrector. He's been the guy that set everything straight. And you have strengthened weak hands. Your words have helped the tottering to stand. And you have strengthened feeble knees. But now it has come upon you and you're impatient. It touches you and you're dismayed. Is not your fear of God, your confidence, and the integrity of your ways, your hope? Isn't that what you base your faith in God on? Remember now, whoever perished being innocent. Now here's the thing that they're thinking. Job, if this is happening to you, you got to be a sinner somewhere along the line. It's got to be because you did something wrong, because God doesn't let this happen to people who have not done wrong. Well, let me tell you folks, right off the bat here, that's the first thing that we got to say is a bunch of hot air. And that's what God says in chapter 38. This is a bunch of hot air. Because those things do happen to people who are good people. Sometimes God calls upon us to do things that nobody else can do. Sometimes He calls upon us to be an example that nobody else can be. To set a standard that nobody else can set. To give advice that nobody else can give. And Job is in that position right now. Here's what I see in this that just impresses the daylights out of me. Is that Job didn't understand why he was going through it, but Job never did blame God. Oh, he he said some things that he probably wanted to take back, like, "Cursed is the day I was born. I wish I had never seen the light of day," Job says. But in the end, when God takes that man and says, "Job, I love what you did for me," because nobody else could do that. "I know it was hard on you, but I'm going to make it better for you than it ever was." Here's the thing that we see, and we see with the wrong perspective. Job's children were killed. How do you ever make up for that? How does God ever make up for Job losing his children? How does He make up for everything that the wife that turned against Job because Job was being in such pain and such agony? You know, when you lose your partner in life because they don't want to put up with your suffering, that's kind of a hard thing to go through. There was only one man who had the training. And when I say training, I mean day after day after day of doing the right thing and having faith in God that was stronger than all of the things that could come upon this man. That's why God picked him. It's why God said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job?" It wasn't because He wanted Job to go through this. It's because He wanted to show people everywhere for all time that this was capable, that we are capable of this. And that when we have faith in God, it will all turn out for our favor. Now you ask, how can it be in Job's favor that he loses his children? That's a toughie. That is a toughie, I'll tell you. But I want you to think about this. You know, when we talk about stuff like this, we're talking about it from a perspective that is wholly physical. We live in this world, and as far as that view is concerned, this is what we have. When we lose this, we don't have anything. But I have developed a different view of things. I am firmly convinced, folks, that this life is a test. That the entirety of our period of time on this earth is a test to see how we develop our character. Not for a continuation of this life, but for a future life. I am convinced that whatever happens to us here and now is of very little consequence to what is prepared for us in the future. Now, that's hard for some people to see. And we were talking in class this morning about the difference between the Corinthians and the Philippians. The Corinthians could never see anything except the physical life. If it didn't benefit them here and now, they weren't interested. The Philippians, on the other hand, they understood that there was something far greater waiting for those who demonstrate the kind of trust in God that Job had. The kind of trust that helps us to get through tough times and not blame God for things that go wrong that are not God's fault. I've often wondered, how is it that we blame God for an act of terror that takes people's lives, when everything in God's Word is designed for that not to happen? Designing a system of living by which we demonstrate our love and our concern for one another, not taking other people's lives. How is it that God gets the blame for that? In Ephesians chapter 4, where it says they become callous and give themselves over to sensuality for the practice of every kind of impurity with greediness. But the next statement is, but you did not learn Christ in that way. You don't find those kind of things in the teachings of Jesus. The teachings of Jesus prevent those kind of things from happening. So how is it that God gets the blame for those things? When you read in Galatians that the fruits of the Spirit are love, joy, peace, patience, all these wonderful things that every country in the world wants from its citizens. And the deeds of the flesh are evident, which are, and it goes through all of the horrible things that we do to one another. So how is it that God gets the blame for those things when every teaching in the Bible is teaching us not to do those things to one another? Sometimes we need a man like Job. But he's not the only one. You look in the scriptures as Paul talks about himself. He says, from my mother's womb I was set apart. Well, that's a long time. That's quite a set apart there for Paul. But I think what that's talking about is that from the time Paul was born, he was watched. And the character of that man developed from that moment that he was born to be the kind of man that God could call upon to go through all that he went through. And I want to read just a little bit about what he went through. And you might ask yourself, why would God let this happen to this man? Why would God allow this to happen to one of his faithful? Here's what Paul says about his own life. Now, this is before a lot of the stuff happened to him later on in his imprisonment and so forth. But here's what he says. He says, are they servants of Christ? In 2 Corinthians 11:23. Are they servants of Christ? I'm talking like I'm crazy. I more so, in far more labor, far more imprisonments, beaten times without number, often in danger of death, often in 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I've spent in the deep. I've been on frequent journeys in dangers from robbers, dangers from rivers, dangers from my countrymen. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And then he says this. He says, I've been in labor and hardship through many sleepless nights, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. And apart from such external things, Paul views all of that as just this stuff on the outside. He says there's daily pressure on me of concern for all the churches. Who's weak without my being weak? Who's led into sin without my intense concern? Do you understand what a person it takes to do that? That not just everybody, not just anybody can step into those shoes and do that job for God? It takes a Job. It takes a Moses. It takes somebody who has seen that God sometimes requires suffering from His people to accomplish His purposes. I'll tell you what, folks. It's not that I think Mel enjoys going through what he's going through. But I think Mel is proud that God considers him worthy. Because understand this about 1 Corinthians 10. God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able. Now, it doesn't say God will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you will bear. It says He will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able. Go back to Job and see. He put a limit on the devil. And then when Job proved himself, He moved the limit and allowed him to go under more hardship. But that was done for us. It wasn't done just so that Job could go through it. It was done so that you and I can see that that's possible and that there's a good reason for it, and that is that you can have the encouragement from Job. You know, it says that Job strengthened feeble knees. Well, I'll tell you what, I think a bunch of the feeble knees that Job strengthened was after this happened. When people read the story of Job, when people understood that God uses His people and requires of them suffering. But understand this. We will never lose. We will never lose out. Because our God is trustworthy. If He calls upon us to go through it, there's a reward in it for us. If that reward is nothing but a pat on the back from the Almighty, can you imagine what it would be like to be Daniel? Daniel. The name Daniel means judged or vindicated of God. But that's not the important thing about Daniel. Daniel, like Job, had proved himself over and over and over again. In every set of circumstances, Daniel had proved himself to be a man of integrity beyond anybody else in the country. So then Daniel is sent a messenger from God, Gabriel, he who stands in the presence of God, came to Daniel and he says, "O man of high esteem." Whew. That gives me goosebumps. To have God send a messenger and give you the title of high esteem. Who does God look up to? That doesn't even seem possible. But that's what the statement means. Oh man, that we're looking up to. Everybody in heaven looking up to Daniel. Everybody in heaven looking up to Job. Because here's a man that prepared himself. And when the tough times came, he used it properly and didn't blame God. And God used him. God used him as an example to me so that I can suck it up and quit whining when things get tough. All of us have examples that we can use in the Scriptures. All of us can look at this book and see that there are endless stories that prepare us to be the kind of people that God wants us to be. if you know that your life's not matching what God wants you to be, and you know what you need to do this morning, would you make your life right with God this morning? Come while we stand and sing the song that we have announced. Come.